Very good. Well, we're going to jump into things pretty quickly here today. I want to typically what I'll do is give a little bit of a recap of the previous material we talked about and then jump into the new material. And so we ended last week by discussing two individuals. First, Thomas Aquinas, and second, Blaise Pascal. And we're in the discussion of balancing the notions of faith and reason, or discussing their compatibility. And Thomas Aquinas, as you'll recall, was creating his masterwork, the Summa Theologia, a decade of work, multiple scribes, and in the midst of this arduous process of creating what would be his magnum opus, which is left unfinished, he attends a Mass, and during that Mass he has an experience, what maybe is referred to as the unio mystica, the mystical experience. And from the mystical experience, he then says, all of my theological works, what I have seen makes all of my theological works but straw. And so we think here someone who has been systematic in their theology, systematic in their philosophical thinking, as a devoutly religious individual, yet cedes the ground to a mystical experience, to a faith-based experience over rationality in that instance. And then we had, of course, Blaise Pascal, who has the experience which is so profound to him that from the experience he writes down this poem and says, not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the God of the philosophers. And then says, I will not forget your words, amen. Writes it onto parchment, sews it into his jacket lining, so as to place it over his heart almost. And this becomes a very important thing for him. Blaise Pascal, of course, is known for creating the Pascaline, the first mechanical calculator. He's a mathematical prodigy. And so here again we see the faith of this individual in some manner drive him over the rationality. But that's of course not fully the case, right? Because these are very much rational beings, and one could say perhaps even their rationality, even their experiences with reason or their commitment to reason was part or integral to their experiences with faith. And so, to quote Elder Jeffrey R. Holland on this campus, I think a year ago, who said, truly rock-ribbed testimony comes both to the head and to the heart. And, of course, in Doctrine and Covenants 8, we have the scripture which says, I will tell to you into your mind and in your heart. And so, the combination of the two is what we will strive to explore in this class, although at times there will be more emphasis on discussing maybe what could be considered sort of reason-based arguments for faith, but we will also must acknowledge and must keep in mind the stories of Pascal, the stories of Aquinas, and many others as we sort of venture sally forth into this great adventure together. And I highly recommend using the term sally forth when with friends and other individuals. I think it works as a, shall we not sally forth to the Cannon Center? Is that where you eat, the Cannon Center? Does anyone eat there? No one eats there. No one lives on campus anymore. I lived on campus for 6 years. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So it's a quick discussion of rationality. So we're talking about reason today. And I'll try to truncate my lecturing and rambling, and we'll open it up for a little more comments and discussion in a little ways, but I think it's helpful to have some of this groundwork laid, and it may help with my audition for this boy band that I'm joining. That's why the camera's here. So Descartes will be a primary, let's see, we've got this in opposite order. Let's start with Socrates. So Socrates, maybe what some might consider one of the first founding philosophers, and maybe be considered the analytic tradition. Socrates, of course, the Socratic method, as you know, is sort of question and answer pedagogical tool that's used in classrooms. And Socrates was known for asking a lot of questions. And so what we know of Socrates, we mostly learn from Plato, but there are other contemporaries who wrote about Socrates. And Socrates was sort of a man about Athens who would frequently engage with individuals in the city. And he was known as somewhat of a gadfly. And by gadfly, in fact, the authorities of Athens referred to him as a gadfly during his trial. But Socrates would go around and engage in questioning with individuals. Now, he would claim, I know nothing. Socrates would say, I know nothing except for the truth that I know nothing. Whereas everyone else thinks they know something, I know that I know nothing. And therefore, I am the wisest person of all. I'm the wisest person in Athens because I'm the only person who knows for sure that understands or grasps their lack of knowledge. Okay, but when you read the early dialogues of Socrates, and these are supposedly penned by Plato, so what occurs is you have a Socrates, and he begins to sort of have followers, and one of them is Plato. And Plato, one of sort of Socrates' disciples, records these dialogues. And just as you read a script of a play or a movie, you have just dialogues. One person says this, another person says this. And so Socrates, it's thought, kind of the most contemporary thinking or history on this is most sort of early historians of early Grecian philosophy believe that the first dialogues, the earliest dialogues of Plato, are actually reflective of the man Socrates, the historical individual Socrates who's engaged in these dialogues. And then later, as we go on, Plato just maybe starts to use Socrates, the man, as a sort of a device to promulgate his own ideas. And so you begin to see within the middle, and then the later dialogues, Platonic dialogues, that you start to have a different kind of Socrates, a Socrates that is actually, in fact, reflective or more reflective, or the dialogues are more reflective of Platonic thought, Plato's thinking. And then, of course, as you know, Aristotle will then become a disciple of Plato in this chain. But let's start with Socrates. So Socrates says, I know that I know nothing. So he kind of gives this first theory of rationality, and the way he decides to explore how you come to knowledge is through this system of this dialectic of asking questions. Right? So you have a thesis. So we could put it over here. And later Hegel, a philosopher named Hegel, will articulate this more clearly. But you'll start with a thesis, right? And then on the other side, if this were, like a Batman film, you'd have what? The antithesis or antithesis, right? And then bringing these two into juxtaposition, you would come up with a synthesis, which I know many of you enjoy in modern music today. Synthesizer. All right. So you have your thesis, your antithesis, your antithesis to bring about a synthesis. And so in this, in the dialectic, in Socratic dialogue, where he's asking these probing questions, then they respond, and he'd ask more questions. Now he claims that he knows nothing, and therefore is the wisest person of all. But reading these dialogues, it sure seems like he's leading the witness to some sort of knowledge. Yet they typically end in what's called aporia, which is no conclusion. Aporia is sort of a Greek term, philosophical term, that the dialogues sometimes end in aporia. But we begin with rationality, with how do we know what we know. We begin kind of with Socrates here, probing these questions of how do we know these things? How do we know this? How do you know this is true? And asking these questions. And maybe, getting, although maybe not clearly articulating, getting closer to this idea of having a thesis-driven conversation with an antithesis and bringing about some sort of synthesis. Okay, then we get to Plato. Plato is a strong believer in mathematics as kind of a revelatory truth of ultimate truth. And he will espouse a particular view of what reality actually represents, and that is in the idea of the forms, the theory of the forms. So has anyone heard of the allegory of the cave? One. Does anyone want to come and draw a picture of the allegory of the cave? The numbers went way down. Anyone willing to do this? We'll do it over here so the camera doesn't record it. No takers?
I can try.
Great. Come on. Let's give a round of applause for. Okay. You can do it over, and I'll get a eraser here. Here you go. Oh, well, I'll get this.
I don't know how to construct this. I have it in my head.
You got it. You got this. I fully believe in your ability to do this.
Okay, so is it okay if I talk out loud and take notes?
You absolutely. In fact, if you want to explain the story as you construct the picture of the cave.
So essentially there's two people. And they're all, chained together. And they're facing this big, let's see, they're facing that wall. Sorry about perspective. And behind them is another wall, on the top of which there are people carrying, like, faces.
Yeah, maybe like hand puppets or cutouts, different things.
Yeah, and then behind those people, there's a big fire. And so the shadows of these people are being reflected on the wall of the cave. And these people, the only thing that they're able to see, because they're chained looking at the wall, the only thing they're able to see is the shadow of these hand puppets or these faces.
Great, that's perfect. That is very good. Can we give a round of applause? Excellent job. Thank you so much. Oddly, this mirrors my frequent dream I have. I'm just kidding. This is the allegory of the cave. So here we have these people. They're chained together right here, and they're looking at these hand puppets at the wall. So, I mean, we have a good example here, right? You guys are chained here, and here are the hand puppets. So that's basically, he's describing a classroom. No, he's not describing a classroom, but it does work conveniently. So you have these little puppets going across, and all of these people are staring at this wall, right? And then these people behind who are doing the sort of the puppets. I mean, they're not hand puppets, they're sort of cutouts of images, almost like you can think of like cookie cutters going across. So to give you some quick background context before we finish the allegory of the cave, does anyone know what happened to Socrates in Athens? Yes?
Wasn't he sentenced to death?
He was sentenced to death. So maybe people have heard the phrase drinking the hemlock. So he was sentenced to drink the hemlock, which he actually, there's a dialogue about him deciding, making the decision to drink the hemlock, even though the guards sort of let him go. They kind of say, "Look, you can call this off, just go and it'll be fine." He feels on principle that he has to live in accordance fully with the law of Athens as it was meted unto him. And so he goes forward with drinking the hemlock. But he was condemned in a trial, very large trial, and he was able to defend himself in the trial. So he was accused, one of the things he was accused of is corrupting the youth. Corrupting the youth of Athens by sort of, critiquing the culture and the important framework of Athenian culture, threatening, in some ways, people felt threatened by him, perhaps politically. And so he was ultimately sentenced in an Athenian trial to death. But in one of the perhaps most famous dialogues, which I highly recommend reading just as a general sort of great works in your life to read this, to be familiar with it, is the dialogue, Plato's dialogue, called the Apology. Now, we know, apologetics comes from the word apology. It means defense. So he's giving a defense for himself at this trial. So, so there you have the context. So Plato obviously saw Socrates as perhaps maybe disagreed with him or transcended him perhaps in some way as a philosopher. He grew beyond Socratic thinking later on in his later dialogues, but clearly respected Socrates. So that context is helpful when thinking about the allegory of the cave. So we have the allegory of the cave, we have the fire, we have the puppets, the hand puppets, the cutouts, whatever you want to characterize them as, and they are showing on the screen on the wall of the cave. And so he says that these people chained up right here, they all judge each other based on who can recognize the images better. So if you can recognize the images really well, this is from Napoleon Dynamite. This is the dove. You can recognize whatever this is like a turkey or etc. So people sitting on the row here would be rewarded if they kind of knew more of the forms that were being shown on the wall, right? So the pecking order was if you could identify these forms on the wall, then you were sort of lauded. So someone gets free. Someone breaks free from the chain, and they walk outside of, they walk outside, stumble out, walk outside the cave. And then some of you know the allegory, so I'll let someone continue with it. Does anyone remember what occurs when the unchained individual sallies forth, as you like to say, outside of the cave? You've got it. Well, you really want to go on? I don't want to make you have to do the whole thing, but you go ahead.
If someone else has something to say, they can.
Speak forth now, if you desire to articulate the cave. I think I'm off camera, so I'm going to go back on. I don't want to think I'm one of those professors who goes off camera. So, okay, please, without further ado.
No, just he goes out of the cave and is like there's light, and he sees like the actual forms of objects, like the reality,
real thing,
realness.
So imagine being locked up in a cave, right, your whole life, and then all of a sudden you go out of the cave, and he's blinded. It's very disorienting, and then finally he comes to and beholds the wonder that is outside of the cave. I mean, this is a glorious vista before him. He sees trees of green and red roses. What is the... All right, so he sees all these wonderful things and says, what a wonderful life. And then what would you do after seeing the... that was voted down as a weak joke. So what would you do then if you had this experience of walking outside of the cave? What would you do if you're an altruistic soul, as I know you to be? Go tell everyone else, right? You'd go tell everyone else. And so he ambles back into the cave. I'm trying to use a different term than Sally Ford. And he walks back into the cave, and he goes to his mates chained up and says to them, lads, maybe young lads perhaps, there's this amazing world out there that is yes, it's kind of like these things you see on the wall, on the cave wall, but it's way more glorious and grand, and I can't even begin to describe to you. You have to come forward and see what's going on here. And so then, is it Lavender? Yes. So what occurs then, Lavender?
Well,
you're doing great so far. If you ever want to exempt yourself, you can.
Well, as far as I can remember, they think that he's insane.
And then what occurs? What's that?
They don't believe him.
They don't believe him? And
Different reality.
and then what do they ultimately do to him? Remember Socrates? Okay, he's dispensed of. I've used some other euphemism. Trying to keep this, again, for the cameras, very G-rated classroom. So, so he's done away with, and so here we have the allegory of the cave, right? The true philosopher, the philosopher that sees outside of this, day-to-day thing where we're just really judging by these, the forms on the wall. And he would say, the sophists, maybe the politicians, some of the Athenian powers that be, they're just looking at these little things on the wall. But the philosopher, the true philosopher, taps into this grand existence, walking out of the cave and sees this whole vista. And then they come down and try to articulate that. And what happens is what results in what occurs to Socrates. Okay, so here we have a different theory of rationality, right? So the philosopher, through maybe the dialectic method, through, in some instances, maybe Plato would say, I think the lesson from Socrates is introspection and questioning. So through this discursive thesis, antithesis, synthesis, you come to a greater understanding. You begin to grasp higher outside the cave and see these forms. And so the philosopher has this in Plato's, I'm not saying, this is Plato's thinking. Plato says then there's rationality, that knowledge, maybe knowledge comes through this philosophical enterprise, that the true philosopher taps into this. Okay, then we fast forward and we get to, and I don't know if this is coming out, but we get to Aristotle, right? And Aristotle is a disciple of Plato. And while very, very intrigued with Plato's thinking, he will try to grapple with some of the things that Plato brings up and find some difficulties, some issues with some of Platonic thought. And Aristotle will be much more interested in, rather than sort of the forms that are transcendent, and finding the forms that are transcendent, he would say we can understand a lot about the forms from gathering information that's here, presently, around us. So he would say, actually, the puppets have a lot to tell us. So let's study the puppets. Let's dissect things, and do early biology. Let's gather constitutions and analyze the constitutions and try to understand what we might call today as political science. Let's try to understand the elements of, earth, wind, fire, and he would also include ether in those. Ether was, when they lived in Athens, there was this mist that would rise from the sea, right? I mean, the sun would heat up the ocean and you'd get some mist that would occur in the mornings. And so they didn't know what this was, right? It was not quite water, and it wasn't quite anything else, and so they called that ether, and they believed that floated up. And so they had some really interesting theories. But look at all of these things, and we can start to do physics and understand that there are these different elements, and so Aristotle will begin to provide maybe a different hue to sort of a thesis-driven, a deductive forms of formal logic and argumentation to support a theory. And putting forth a theory, trying to understand the theory, and then supporting that theory based on argumentation. Okay, any questions here before we go to Descartes, and then we will talk a little bit about formal logic. Any strong feelings that want to be expressed? Okay, all right. So, I think I'm getting outside of range here on this. There's our Aristotle. Okay, so Descartes will ask the question, can we really know anything? There seems to be a suggestion that, yeah, we can know something. Well, we begin with Socrates that I know nothing, therefore I know at least that. So I know something, right? Then there's an assumption in Plato that at least the philosopher, although a lot of these folks looking at the forms that are on the wall may not grasp it all, at least the philosopher can tap into some greater knowledge and explain the true forms, the true realm of the forms to us here in Athens staring at the wall. In Aristotle, there's sort of a robust understanding of rationality and the ability to make deductions from first premises, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get to Descartes, much later on. And Descartes will question all of this. He'll go back to the very beginnings and say, what if yes, I can perceive things. I can perceive what I perceive to be reality. Here is this table. It feels like it exists. Sorry for the noise for anyone who's decides to watch this. It's going to air right after Studio C. Becoming Socrates at the drama. So I perceive this table. It exists. It seems to exist here. I can pound on it. But what if I'm being deceived? Now this will become the basis of many lucrative blockbuster films. You can rattle them off. The Matrix. One of these, I think all of Christopher Nolan films. The Inception. What else? I don't know. It's also, I wake up from a dream. I mean, most films now use this. If only Descartes had cinematography, he would have been very wealthy. But, I mean, what's all this about, philosophy majors not being able to generate funds for themselves or not being able to find them? You can create movies with philosophy. This has made so many movies off of this. So Descartes asks, what if I'm being deceived by an evil demon? Or in The Matrix, what if I'm hooked up to a computer? Or in Inception, what if I'm in dreamscapes? Anyways, whatever the premise is, yada, yada, yada. What if I'm dreaming? What if I'm being deceived? What if my sense perceptions are fooling me? What if there's an evil demon? That's what Descartes will settle on an evil demon, but that doesn't seem like it makes good modern cinema. What if there's an evil demon that's deceiving me and making projections in my mind that thus I think that there are things in front of me, but actually there are not? Also an episode of Star Trek. Just want to keep rattling all these off. So he will ask this question, and then he will cycle back to the first thing, the absolute thing, the essence of what he knows. And so this is the famous philosophical term that you can not impress anyone with, but cogito ergo sum, which is I think, therefore I am. So I think, and because of my thinking, I have the essence of thought. And so the most essential thing I know is thought. And from that thought, he builds back an entire scaffolding and architecture and a whole building of knowledge based on thought. And the physical world may be a deception, but the mental world cannot be a deception in Descartes' view. And so this will end up bringing another philosophical problem up called the mind-body problem. We'll talk about that later. I'm just perhaps adumbrating this for you. But this will be the question of rationality. How do we know what we know? Can we know what we know? Well, we will discuss that at length in another class. But suffice it to say, let's assume we're all rational and we can know things, and we can then move forward with the remainder of this class. But we will circle back to that question at length. So again, rationality. There are two kind of primary forms of rationality. Theoretical, in other words, based on theory. So we observe the world, and the world reflects on the self. So we can learn things about the world based on theories, a thesis, and then we can support that thesis with understanding that we observe from the world. So much of physics is sort of derived or understood this way in maybe theoretical rationality. Practical rationality is the self imposed on the world. So, is it, for example, we may not find it practical. I think the book uses this example, that we may not find it practical to go and try to find a life, extraterrestrial life. It may not be practical, economic costs, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't know, we won't know the answer to it, right? So it's, it just may not be a practical thing to understand. So this will help us if we have some sort of goal in mind that we can then impose upon the world. This is another idea of rationality. So let's say we want to open up our own taco shop, And then, we take the rational steps to make that come to fruition. This is ourselves imposing or projecting onto the world our rationality. Okay, so as part of that, there are different forms of reasoning or different forms of logic that we will end up using in this course as we assess arguments. Arguments such as, does God exist? Or arguments such as, is a benevolent God compatible with the problem of evil's existence in the world? So there'll be different arguments that are put forward by different philosophers, and we will need to have sort of the tools to be able to dissect those and engage with those. So does anyone want to does anyone know or have a sense for deductive reasoning? What kind of reasoning is deductive reasoning? Or want to guess? Yes.
Well, deductive reasoning is when instead of trying to say something is true, you're trying to say what isn't true. So like you say, well, if this can't be true, then this can't be true, then I guess it must be this.
So that's good. That's a little bit like, it's close. So it's a little bit what we'll talk about what Sherlock Holmes does. And it's a little bit different kind of reasoning. But he frequently calls it deductive reasoning, so it's a little bit of a trick question because he's always saying this is, it's pure deduction. And in fact, it's actually not deduction. But he uses that, so sometimes, yes?
This is from my understanding. It's usually taking something small, what you know, and then using something bigger.
Okay, that's another kind of reason. I won't make you guess anymore. But this is good. You kind of have a sense already for that there are different kinds of reasoning that we do every day. You probably had to go through a very rigorous reasoning process of whether you're going to show up to hear me ramble. But there, you can kind of understand that in your life, you use reason in different ways to understand the world around you, to engage, to try to make wise decisions. Okay, so deductive reasoning is basically if you assume the premises, if you assume some information, then it has to be true what follows from that information. So the conclusion must follow. It always follows from the premises in deductive reasoning. So we'll give an example here. Oh, I think I have to edit this because I wanted to use. I brought a object lesson for this, and I wanted to put Diet Coke. So just substitute this for Diet Coke, because I think that's an important distinction to make here. So all church universities serve Diet Coke. BYU is a church university. BYU serves Coke. Okay, so that's an example of deductive reasoning. If these premises, these are called the premises, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must follow. It must be true. Okay? Now, these could be, the premises could be false. So there's a famous writer, Alice in Wonderland. His name is Lewis Carroll, and he was a logician at University of Cambridge. And he would put all sorts of silly, I should have compiled some examples because I'm not going to give you any, I don't know any of the examples off my head, but he would compile all these silly, deductive, nonsensical syllogisms. Syllogism is this whole thing. We call this a syllogism. He would create these nonsensical syllogisms that were based on silly words, So all, wobblies are fobblies. Dobbly is a fobbly, therefore, etc. So he'd make up fake words and then put them into a syllogistic form. And if the premises are true, so if you assume these, then this has to follow from it. But these premises could be false. So you can assume them, and then you can derive a lot of them. But this is how we do a lot of there's a lot of deduction in the world from this. If we assume this, we may not know. So do we have any mathematicians or math majors? We have some engineers. So doing proofs, this is right. You assume some things, and then from them you can derive. So this is the same principle. Assume these, and you get this for sure. Okay, now one of the manipulative tricks of Sherlock Holmes is he'll frequently say that he's doing deductive reasoning. usually to persuade Watson or to persuade those around him. But he's in fact not doing deductive reasoning. It's one of the great sleights of hand of Sherlock Holmes. So what he's actually doing is abductive reasoning, but first we're going to talk about inductive reasoning, which is different. Maybe we'll just do abductive because I just mentioned it. I think you're going to see the... Okay, so abductive reasoning is what Sherlock Holmes actually does. So we'll start with gathering a bunch of information and then drawing out the hypothesis. What he claims is the conclusion, but it's really just a hypothesis. So I'll start saying something to the effect of, you know, there's a murder on the train. There were 5 people in the train. I know that this person who had the hat on was in the back of the train the entire time because whatever. I know that this person left the train at this time to go hunt buffalo, etc. These are all real examples from Sherlock Holmes books. They're not. Okay, so he starts to gather information, and then he says it's elementary, Watson, and then gives exactly who the person is, right? But this isn't deductive, right? It's actually abductive. So it's its best guess. So we call that the best possible explanation. So the way I like to think of it is sickness. It's a frequent pastime of mine, I don't know if it's yours, of trying to Google the various illnesses that come into your life and then try to do abductive reasoning to give your best possible explanation. It usually ends up in some extreme case where you have some wild exotic disease that you never heard of because you went down a Google rabbit hole. Or a snoogle one. Use that phrase. I hope I haven't introduced that phrase already. So this is abductive reasoning. This is your best guess. This is what Sherlock Holmes is doing, gathering information and trying to make your best guess. Now, a lot of people ridicule this and say, well, it's kind of shaky, right? I mean, deductive is not shaky. Deductive is, if the premises are true, so if you could prove those premises, you know it has to follow from those premises. And so if you can just prove those premises, then you're on pretty solid ground. Whereas abductive is a whole different ballgame. It's shaky. But is there anything redemptive about abductive reasoning? Is there who here shall hold forth to give the case for abductive reasoning? No one else has Googled various illnesses that they feel like they have and then tried to test them? Well, here's what anyone want to say? Thoughts? Is there anything redemptive? Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't it be like, you can't really come to a sure conclusion, but like, in the circumstance, like, you can't pull out a bacteria and be like, oh, this is what's causing this illness, but it's, I mean, you can get to something close or something, I don't know.
Yeah, anyone else? Yeah.
Just on the medical thought train, sometimes you can like diagnose something without even having, like you said, like the exact like thing telling you that's it. So even if doctors can do it, like you can know like pretty certain any other option is pretty like low chance, but that's like the most likely chance usually.
Okay. So it's a good tool. It's a good tool. It's not perfect, but it's the best we got, and we use it all the time, right? We use it all the time. No, I don't know where he's at, but my best guess would be he's at the Cougar Eat because I frequently see him there, and he loves chimichangas. I don't know if they sell them at the Cougar Eat. But you gather the information you have, and then you try to, based on it, give the best guess. We use this all of the time, all of the time. Okay. All right, so again, hypothesis from observations, conclusion is the best guess. Sherlock Holmes is the example here. But let's go back to inductive reasoning. Okay, so inductive reasoning also is not perfect like deductive reasoning. And by the way, deductive reasoning has a lot of limits. Although it's very strong, it's hard to apply in a lot of, it's not very flexible, right? It's not very flexible. Although it's a really good tool, it's not particularly flexible. So inductive reasoning will deal in probabilities. It cannot tell us with certainty, like deductive reasoning can, but it can tell us probabilities. So the example here from our Diet Coke is BYU Hawaii serves Diet Coke. BYU Idaho serves Diet Coke. LDS Business College, I don't know if they're changing the name of that, but we'll keep it there for now, serves Diet Coke. So it's likely, we can't conclude 100%, right? It's likely, it's a high probability that BYU Provo serves Diet Coke. And I have, again, I spent all of the pizza money that I would have dedicated to the pizza I'm promising on this Diet Coke. As a visual aid. So this provides us a set of, a tool in our toolbox, in our reasoning toolbox, that it gives us the ability to do fairly, it's a fairly robust tool. Again, it's not perfect, it's not deductive reasoning, but we do, again, this is something we do quite frequently, right? Trees are green. Well, do you know that all trees are green? What do we think? How do we know that all trees are green? And are all trees green? What would we have to do to know for certain if all trees are green? Yes? Do you have it?
Well, we'd have to like see every single tree that every single
tree.
But that's really
Exactly. So we have to go through and have an exhaustive taxonomy of every tree, and we'd have to visit not just every kind of tree, but every instance of tree to make a conclusion of. And so what do? Well, we say, spruce and maple, and we come up with all of these trees are basically, from what I can tell, are mostly all green. And so I can broadly say that it's likely that trees are green. Now, are there going to be exceptions? Yeah, but it's a high probability that if you find a tree out there, it's probably green. So, you can feel confident in when you say trees are green. Are likely green, or that tree is likely green. Like, oh, you fell out of a tree, it's likely green, that type of thing. Very useful in various conversations. Okay, so we talked about deductive reasoning, we talked about inductive reasoning, and we talked about abductive reasoning. And now we're going to transition into talking about different theological models. We'll use this if we get to the material today toward the end of class when we start talking about arguments for the existence of God, and different kinds of arguments that are used to try to prove the Diet Coke, trying to prove the existence of God. But first, we will talk about models, theological models, with regard to different conceptions, theological models that will help us provide kind of a broad framework as we begin the course. They are kind of helpful to understand the history with regard to some of these theological models. They're not exhaustive. But before we do that, are there any questions, strong feelings, expressions of anger or elation that want to be evinced? Yes.
Just kind of how does
Elation?
No.
Hopefully no. Okay.
I was just wondering because you had science as I guess example for abductive reasoning, and how does science or sickness filter into abductive reasoning?
So sickness, how do you think it filters into abductive reasoning? That was very Socratic of me, I apologize for
I'm not really sure. I guess in trying to decipher what you have, you look at your symptoms, and based off your symptoms you give your best guess of what you are sick with.
Perfect. So that was a great explanation. So here we go. So we're taking observations, right? We're observing, well, I'm sneezing, I have I have a plant growing out of my pelvis or something, I don't know, whatever the symptoms are. That's a common one I experience, not to be too descriptive of my own health. No, but there are various health, you observe what's going on. I sneeze, or I'm coughing, or I have a fever, right? I have a sore throat. And then from that, that may apply to a lot of different things, right? But let's say I have a telltale sign of a circle on my arm from a tick bite. with all those symptoms, and then I can say, I have Lyme disease when I, Google all those, or something like that. I'm just giving an example. I don't want to personalize it because we all have different illnesses, and okay. So that gives you the sense for abductive reasoning. But this applies beyond, right? I mean, we use this in all sorts of contexts. So can anyone think of other contexts in which this might be used in your everyday life or in your academic discipline, etc. Because these aren't sort of always used in isolation. They're very much cross-pollinated. We'll use one, and then all of a sudden, once we get some information from one, we'll start to try to deduce from it, right? So, if that makes sense. So all of a sudden, if we find a bunch of symptoms and we have a hypothesis of what's going on, we might then do a study and say, will this medicine work on these people? And then we can maybe deduct based on the data from that this might be a helpful medicine, something like that, right? So I mean, these are used together in various different ways. Yes?
Is it kind of like a process of elimination? If it's the best possible explanation, you see this, okay, this doesn't seem like it works, you move on to the next one, okay, this doesn't seem like it works, or is that more like deductive reasoning?
I think that is you're observing, you're testing different things. I think those would be observations. But you could like drill down in each observation and maybe do deduction in that specific observation. So like I said, I don't think it is helpful from a framework standpoint to just sort of master these and try to come up with your own examples. There are examples in the book. There's lots of examples online, obviously. So what kind of reasoning did I use there? There are lots of examples online. Yeah, probably big. I don't know. So, I'm just curious. So if I like observe all the examples, and then my guess is that they're online. Or you could say inductive. I've been online. I've seen this example, so I can say that there are lots of examples online. But you can you test these out and just say, okay, what kind of form of reasoning is, and then I think it can help you, and you can start to see how these blend together and work together. And they're different frameworks of rationality. They're different helpful frameworks in understanding how we know what we know. So rationality is based on the idea that there are hypotheses or beliefs or theses that we put forward, and then we support them with argumentation. So we're providing arguments for, and then in the context of philosophy of religion, we're providing reasons for the faith that is within us, right? This is the language from, we've all been doing Come Follow Me, Paul. So Paul said, give a reason for the hope that is within you, right? So we're giving a reason, providing rational basis where possible, reasons for a assertion, a thesis, a belief, a faith, a hope, and then sussing out those. So that's in the context of philosophy of religion. But in many other contexts, we use this all the time, right? Engineering, computer science, etc. Yes?
So just in the way of religion, I think we use it all the time when we're trying to understand the spirit. When you say, like, for instance, like, I'm in church and I felt this way when this person said this, and so when we're in another situation, we take that with us, the experience, and we say, well, I felt this way when I thought it was the spirit, so then it must be the spirit. That's the best possible explanation. So that's kind of like
Yeah, so you're using abductive reasoning, or you may even use deductive reasoning in some cases, where you're saying, if I assume these premises are true, then it must follow such, and therefore I do this. So, I mean, in the spiritual context, in our own personal spiritual context, I think we use these all the time. We use these forms. And so what we're doing when we're trying to give reason for the hope that's within us, when we're trying to understand that, we are drawing on all of the tools that we have, and these are three tools of rationality as we analyze arguments that will be put forward in the class in various contexts. So, okay, any other thoughts or comments? Yeah.
So the difference between abductive and inductive is abductive, like you think you have all the information, and then you can make an argument from it, and then I feel like inductive, you're missing something, so you're just using as many examples as you can find?
Yeah, so inductive is a little bit like metaphor, finding like examples. So in the legal context, we've got our resident paralegal here, my future counsel. So what in a legal context we might use what as sort of inductive reasoning? We'd say this case is like this case and like this case and like this case. Therefore, it's the ruling should be similar to those cases.
Well, this all depends on the case, but if it's the same, like for instance, like we do a lot of divorce, so usually, when we have cases where, for instance, the other party doesn't have an attorney, usually the case goes pretty fast because they don't have an attorney. So there's like, we go to mediation, it's like, okay, so it's gonna be, instead of being a full day from 9 to 5, it's gonna be like a half day.
Yeah,
So
and
we'll
so you
just-
can kind of predict it.
Yeah,
Why
so
can
you
you
can
predict it?
Because it's happened before.
Because it's happened before, and so we call this in a legal context, we call it precedent, right? There's precedent for this. So you've just seen it so many times, you're like, oh, here we go, it's gonna be half day, I'm gonna go grab an extra Diet Coke or whatever. This class is sponsored by Diet, I'm just kidding. But I do think we do, university does have some sort of, I'm not recommending Diet Coke, I rarely drink it, my son gave me a hard time for drinking it. I live in a very water-centric, familial home, so this is my transgression for today. We've seen it so many times that we kind of can draw the conclusion. Now, does she know for sure? Does she know for certain that the divorce proceeding is going to go the certain way? No, it may be different, right? It may be different. So only probabilities. You can say, well, this divorce proceeding with the similar characteristics went this way. This divorce proceeding with similar characteristics went this way. And so there's a high probability, there's a likelihood, I'm using inductive reasoning, that it's going to go this way. But it's just a probability. Something else could come up in the case, right? So we see how that kind of works. I use this, this is a very good example. I was going to try to use a dating example in my early life with my wife, but I'll spare you that. I will try to draw upon many dating examples from my courtship with Holly and from my experiences in Glenwood apartment complex. Many philosophical examples can be derived from Glenwood. And there's no judgment here as a former resident of Glenwood, but if anyone wants to identify themselves as living in Glenwood, I would feel a special camaraderie with you. No, you don't have to reveal, it's okay.
My parents met at Glenwood.
There you go, see, isn't that amazing? So I lived there, your parents lived there, my mother-in-law lived there. That is a troubling thought, all right. I'll give you another one. Wymount apartment complexes. We had a general authority who came to the Wymount ward who was giving a testimony and said, I remember having my first job at Wymount. So it's anyway, some of these buildings have been around. It means they're built well, which is very positive. Okay, what kind of reasoning was that? All right. Another term that you might want to be familiar with is a posteriori. So this is from observation, a posteriori, and then a priori. This is from logic theoretical deduction. So post means ex post. It means post-production. When does post-production take place? After. So this is, I've learned after the fact. I've observed and I've learned after the fact, and so I can have an a priori observation, an a posteriori observation. A priori is, again, we go to Descartes, right? He's using purely his rational thinking before even observation, if that's possible, which is a question, but just for the purposes of learning these terminologies. If before observation, in your mind, you can have theoretical deductions before you observe. So where do we see this? Theoretical physics, right? String theory. Is anyone a strong proponent of string theory? The elegant universe is a great film. You familiar with it? We probably watched it together in Boston, back in Belmont. No, string theory. Do we know for certain if it's true or not?
No.
Has it been observed in the world?
No.
There are some observations, but it's maybe a good mix of the two. So string theory is, I won't get into I'm not a physicist, although I would love to play one, hence the video camera. So string theory is a series of, yes, there are observations about how the physical universe operates, right? But then we also start to make some theoretical leaps and deductions a priori. Okay, so then those gives you two. So that's our kind of our quick little vignette, our dipping the toe in the water, so to speak, of different forms of rationality, different forms of logical reasoning. And from there, we will use that information, and then we will kind of talk now about 6 theological models, frameworks that will kind of help us have sort of a heuristic for as we talk about philosophy of religion. And then we will start to apply what we've learned here in terms of rationality to arguments for the existence of God. So that gives you a little bit of framework. We'll take a break in a few minutes here, but I guess we can take a break now, and then we'll do 5 minutes bathroom. You are adjourned.